Today, Chuck and Brock talk about Perception, Chapter 24, by Professor A. Mark Smith, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy. This is Generous Theology.
Yeah, great point. Everything we just said earlier about Aristotle, like you pointed out, could just as well be said today of Einstein. And yet, people today, like myself, would be reluctant to want to give up some of the models that he proposed, or let's say this, give up some of the thought experiments that were behind some of the intuitive ways that he was thinking. Now, this has something to say about the history of science and its relationship with the ontology, with the actual reality of the world we live in. So in one sense, Einstein is just wrong. Newton is just wrong. Aristotle is just wrong. And the current thing we have today, the standard model, is quote unquote wrong, even though we hold it tentatively, which is to say, we have the history of science to give us reason to expect that maybe in the future, something else revolutionary will come along and completely change the model. So in that sense, the Middle Ages, you can see why people in the modern era would look down upon people from the Middle Ages and call them backward, maybe call them obscurantist, maybe have a dialectical step of pride, some form of intellectual hypergamy. Look at who people used to be versus where we are now. But in some sense, nothing's changed. We're just a little bit further down the road. And what's to say that in this naturalistic setting, maybe 500 years from now, people don't look back at us and point the finger and laugh in that sort of Socratic audience sort of way that we studied with Robert Paul Wolff. And so that's a really interesting view there. One of the other things that tickled me thinking about this was this idea of the physic versus the metaphysic. And so if you look at the scientific theories, even though the models proposed in the Middle Ages turned out to be incorrect, and even though they were still useful, these models actually preceded science and in some sense drove the investigation. So really in some way, scientific investigation seems to depend not just on a study of physics, but on a study of metaphysics. In other words, you don't find the thing that you're not looking for as a general rule. Can we really make the physics, metaphysics abstraction? Can we put things into nice, neat boxes, such as we perhaps want to do? So I found that very interesting and wondered how that might be relevant today to the sort of materialistic claims that wishes to, on an a priori basis, exclude the supernatural. Because after all, that was just a part of the medieval thought back when we didn't know things as well as we know things today. So how does did this chapter change maybe how you might talk to somebody engaging with science has disproved Christianity, those kinds of conversations? Has this chapter maybe changed that or modified that a little bit for you?
I don't know if it's so much modified it as it's just strengthened the resolve to make sure that we aren't cutting off areas of inquiry because we've just decided that they're not valuable. It's interesting how, what for me, probably the most difficult section of this chapter was the section that went into some of the scientific ideas of the day about how the eye works. Scientific ideas that are a little different than what we understand today, but also for the layperson, quite frankly, when you first look at it and read about how it's described, you realize this isn't all that off, even though the parts where it is off would be problematic. But it is interesting how much the metaphysical aspect of perception and this idea that how do we perceive? Is there some sort of impression being made, whether it's the air or the water, flesh, for the various senses, and is it the species? Is that its own thing, or is it an emanation from the original thing? And those are in many ways, they are very much metaphysical questions because they get into sort of metaphysical issues of how do we perceive and what causes us to be able to perceive and what spiritually, what is perception anyway? And yet it was really those kinds of things that drove people to try to understand and understand how does it all work. And without that, we would have missed out. And who knows? If people weren't asking those questions, would we have as great of an understanding of the workings of the eye today as we do? And similarly, there are real transcendent questions that are important to think about. And it is only through the consideration of those transcendent questions that we may be able to come to learn something, important. And it may be that it is a consideration. And I'm not even just talking about religious questions or theological questions, but just why is there a tendency for humans to engage in conflict or war? Or what is the difference between the Homo economica, the person who behaves in an ideal way, an expected way for their own benefit? Why is that different than the way that we actually behave? Those are important questions, and they aren't necessarily questions that can be answered empirically. And yet it is important to consider those things because we may, as a result of those things, get some answers. And in fact, I know that on some of those questions, there is some study today, and there is some controversy today, even as to how to go about doing those studies, because there are those who want to limit even studies of those kinds of things to merely the empirical. How do you do that? How do you limit to merely the empirical doing a psychoanalytic study of the way humans behave in certain systems and in certain situations? Yeah, it does really make the point that we Christians often make, that there is much more to life than merely the physical or merely the empirical.
Let me throw out something that struck me in this chapter, and that's the idea of the importance of the intuitive in constructing these theories. Now, Albert Einstein would talk about how he would spend a lot of time just sitting and thinking in a creative mode. So he wasn't trying to herd equations. Maybe let's put it that way. He wasn't trying to do some sort of mechanistic series of transformations to see where he could go in developing his theories. Instead, he talked about how he would just sit and think, and just how ideas would intuitively come to him. And I was struck reading this chapter as well that it's very similar. The appeal of Aristotle is largely an intuitive one. And so the reason why Aristotle had such legs, let's put it this way, and Chuck, I don't want you having this image of Aristotle at the side of the road waving down a ride by sticking out his leg and saying, "Hey, big boy, are you going to the city?" Those are not the legs I'm talking about. But just this idea that Aristotle's appeal and the genius of him has to do with how plugged in he was to the intuitive aspects, how his model appealed to some. Now, I don't want to say how his model inspired people to think about things, but that's a close word. So in other words, even though Aristotle was quote unquote wrong, there was something about him. There was something about him that appealed and had this intuitive aesthetic to it. And so we have to wonder at some point, is our study of science actually a study of science, a study of the ontology of reality, or is our study of science merely a study of the intuitive ways we can look at reality, and how that introduction of an intuitive bias might actually be a difficulty? It might raise concerns about the competency and adequacy of human subjects to even perform science in the first place. What would you say to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking of the intuitive nature of Aristotle, I was focused primarily on how his categories and his ways of thinking mesh with day-to-day life, meshed with real things, but did so in a way that did not put short shrift to more deeper thinking, a deeper intellectual kind of idea. And the importance, I was thinking of how perhaps what really made Aristotle important is that he could connect to. There is a sense in which it is really important to be able to think in these categories that get beyond merely the day-to-day, get beyond merely what you're perceiving, and get into really intellectual discourse. But there always has to be a connection to the practical as well. And so where I was going as I was thinking about this is, you'll recall when we were reading the 19th century, Cambridge History of 19th Century Philosophy, there was at certain points this movement towards or back to a sort of a common sense, realistic way of thinking when things got a little too far in certain irrationalist ways of thinking. And obviously, we can point out that there are reasons for that, that there's, as we've read in our history of Christian philosophy as well, there is this inability in secular philosophy that doesn't recognize the presence of God. There is this sort of natural pendulum back and forth between over rationalist and an over irrationalist way of looking at it. But even within that, it does suggest to me that there's always an importance to thinking about the real everyday things that people care about. And among those real everyday things that people care about do come in some of these sort of more transcendental questions. Why do people behave in a certain way? Or why does the world behave in certain ways that don't seem to make sense simply from a mechanistic operation way of thinking? And so I know that's not necessarily an answer to your question, but that's the direction that I was going, in that there is always, I think perhaps there's sometimes a danger even in getting so tied up in the depth of philosophy that we forget that the reason that we study this is because of everyday people and everyday lives and the questions that we everyday people ask in our everyday lives, and we need to tie it into those kinds of things. And so, given that questions of religion and theology and belief and worldview, which cannot necessarily be easily dealt with in a merely empirical way of looking at things, in a merely what can we sense with our sense organs, given that there is so much there that people are concerned about, that just again shows the importance of not limiting science to merely empirical, but making it a bigger discussion. And I know there's been some discussion through the chapters in this book too, even about how the medievals define science a little differently than we do. And maybe there's a sense in which we have to think about those definitions again and think a little more broadly. And I apologize, I know that wasn't a direct answer to your question, but it's where I was headed as you were speaking and thinking about what you were saying. I apologize for maybe taking a little off track.